We are going to start taking a look at some of our reflection options and the interactions between hypervoxels in different objects. So let's go ahead and clear this out. We'll go ahead and move our camera just a little, even though it will just get reset by creating a new scene. I'm not going to keep our default camera. And first I want to load in just a Lightwave object sphere. And now I'm going to position this and also change our camera view to shaded solid. And I'm going to go ahead and just scale this down and put it towards the ground plane and almost on it. And then we can go up to the surface editor for that. And the first thing I want to do is turn off our diffusion and bring it all the way down to 0, because we're going to be making this a reflective object. And we're going to go to our reflection, make sure that is all the way. And then we can close that out, and we're going to go to our view interface. And then we can add a sphere to match up between our two programs. And the cool thing is we'll be able to reflect back and forth between these objects. So we'll open up the surface editor. We're going to make the same modifications. I'm going to make our reflections under the reflection tab, bring that up all the way, and I don't need to worry about our diffusion. And we're going to go over into Lightwave, and now we can see these objects are different sizes, which is going to be okay, and actually be a little bit better just for the overall reflectivity. So we'll modify our camera position just a little. And I also want to create a little bit of a different atmosphere. And what I want to do is go to our sun, and we're going to increase the pitch, and then I can add in a cloud layer as well. And we could use, let's use our low clouds, and click OK. Of course, we don't really have a preview until we go into our view interface. So we can see what that looks like right now within the view interface. And paying attention to the shadows as well. And I'm also going to go up to our camera options, making sure we right mouse click, although we can see a nice little preview that was created of the current view scene. And I'm going to change this to 16 by 9, and let's do a 800 by 450 render. Go over to Lightwave, and now all of our camera options will synchronize themselves. And let's go ahead and render a frame. First, let's go to our globals and make sure that trace reflection is on, and then we can also take a look at the ray recursion depth, and basically how many times we're reflecting back and forth between two reflective objects. Kind of like when you look into a mirror and you see an infinite amount, the recursion depth will allow us to choose how many amounts we see. So we can go to our render tab and select render frame, and now we can take a look at these two objects. And already I can tell that I don't have smoothing turned on for the Lightwave object, so I want to make sure I turn off, just cancel the render, go to our surface editor, and make sure that for that sphere I have smoothing turned on. Let's go ahead and we can render that frame. And we can see these two reflective objects are reflecting one another, and we can see that showing up on both of them. Right now I have anti-aliasing turned off, so we don't have a nice smooth edge, but we can see that with the diffusion turned off and 100% reflection on our surface for the Lightwave object, and with even the default diffusion and ambient on the surface for the view object, we still have basically the exact same object. And now, because this is a very low polygon sphere, we're seeing a little bit of distortion in there, but that's just caused by the fact that it's a very low resolution object. And what we could do is switch over to Modeler and always turn on subdivisions and make it a subdivided surface. But we can also see that our shadows are showing up from our clouds, which will also cast shadows on our Lightwave object. But we're going to modify the scene just a little bit, move our camera around. We can see that a little bit better. I can switch over to Modeler, and we have our sphere in there. I can go ahead and hit the Tab key, and that way we'll have a rounded sphere. It'll look a little bit better. And I'm just going to turn on some anti-aliasing. So we'll go to our camera properties, and I'm going to change our anti-aliasing amount to 3. And we just have a 3 pass. We're still working with the classic camera. Then we also want to go up to our volumetric options using Control F6 and make sure volumetric anti-aliasing is on, and that way we'll get those nice passes in there. So let's go ahead and just render out a current frame. And now we can see a much nicer render with the anti-aliasing on. We can see that all of our shadows are matching up correctly, and we have a really nice reflection between these two objects. And since this one's smaller, we can really see almost directly into the other reflections of this object. And we can also see that going down through that object as well. And we've got just a really nice reflection, and if this was a flatter object and something that wasn't completely reflective, we would be able to see those cloud shadows being cast on the object itself. And there are other reflective types of objects within Lightwave, and mainly that's hypervoxels. So let's go ahead and take a look at that really quick, and how to kind of deal with some of the problems you'll run into. So we're going to go to the Dynamics tab, and I'm going to add in a particle object, which we're going to have HV emitter. I can leave this called emitter, and that should be fine. I'm going to go ahead and move this, and just move our emitter into the back a little. And what I want to do is create a little bit of a particle animation just to move those particles up, and we can add hypervoxels to it. So what I want to do is just change our gravity and increase that amount. Let's go ahead and change that to 5 on the y-axis, and that way we can have our particles moving up. What I also want to do is go to our generator, fix it, and change the start frame to -6. And that way, still at frame 0, we can have those particles showing up. We'll select our camera. We're going to move in and take a look more specifically at these hypervoxels. And we can turn on Viper, so we'll be able to render out a nice preview of them. And we'll go to our object and highlight it and select it. But we also want to hit Control F6 to go back into our volumetrics, and now I'm going to add in hypervoxels. We double click on it, and we also want to double click on the emitter where all of our objects are showing up, and that way we can see a preview of our hypervoxel object. I want to increase our particle size and give us a nice overall shape, and we're going to go to the shading and turn our reflection up to 100%. I'm also going to turn down our diffusion level down to 0%. And now this is the same surface that we have on the spheres. Go ahead and close out Viper, and let's take a look at a render of this hypervoxel object in the view scene. And we can see that the hypervoxels are completely reflecting the view scene, and also this view object, this spheres that we have in there, and the Lightwave object. But what we need to take a look at is our view reflective object. So let's go into our camera, and we're going to move this into position. So we can take a look at both the hypervoxel object, which I'm going to go ahead and move over just a little bit. So it's kind of next to our view sphere. And we're going to re-render a frame, or create a new frame. Oop, undo, making sure we're not banking the camera. And let's go ahead and render that out and take a look. And we can see that we have reflection between both of our objects still, even with using the hypervoxels reflection. So our view object is completely reflecting our hypervoxels, and it all looks really good. We can go ahead and close that out. But I'm going to go back into the Hypervoxels panel. Go ahead and open that up. And you can see that right now, even though we don't have self shadows on, normally that would be casting shadows upon itself, you can see there really isn't an option for turning off our shadows to cast them on the scene. But when we rendered, the Hypervoxels object had no shadows. So if we take a look at that again with a new render, and now this will be casting shadows on itself, you can take a look at the render. And now by looking at all the objects, and we can see that both of those are casting shadows, but not the Hypervoxels object. So the Hypervoxels are not casting shadows, and they usually don't within our view scene. And that's definitely one thing to keep in mind, because of course one of the biggest and greatest advantages of having xStream within Lightwave is the ability to use Hypervoxels with your scenes, because there's so much you can do with the combination of the two. But keep in mind those shadows are not necessarily going to show up directly on your view scenes, which means on ecosystems and things like that. And let's change this to a volume, going back into the Hypervoxels panel. We're going to change this to a volume object. Take a look at Viper. We can see what it looks like. And go through our geometry, and all that looks like it should be pretty good. And we can see our active light is the view light. We turn that off, and we can do another render. And we can see that volume now, where we have sort of a smoke and kind of a puffier object. There are no shadows in our scene being cast by this object. It will cast shadows on our Lightwave object still, but casting them in the view scene, we don't see that, and of course that can cause some problems. And it's just something to keep in mind while you're working on the combination of using Hypervoxels directly within a majorly view environment. But other than the shadows, that's really the only major drawback that we have. And I just want to take a look at another surfacing option when we're working with view objects. So let's take this sphere, and I'm going to kind of move it in front of our hypervoxel and also our view object in our view sphere. We're going to go to this surface editor, and I'm going to increase our diffusion back up to 100%, turn off our reflection all the way. And what I want to do is take a look at transparency. And we're going to raise this up to a little bit of a higher value. We'll do 71%. And now go ahead and render out this frame and take a look at what happens. And what we can see is that our transparency is going through the frame and basically to that black background that's a default for Lightwave. And we're not seeing the objects in the scene through it. We're not seeing really the hypervoxels at all, and we're not seeing the view sphere behind it. If we take a look though at the actual view sphere itself, we can see that it is reflecting the correct object, but the display directly within Lightwave, we don't have that reflective object or transparent object showing up correctly. If we take a look at the refraction index, I'm going to go ahead and change this to 1.01 just to add a tiny little bit of refraction. And I'm going to go ahead and render the frame. And now we can see the objects behind it, and the transparency is basically corrected. Of course, we've got a little bit of a refraction on there, so we're seeing that show up. But overall, it has made this object render correctly. It does look a little bit different from the one in our reflection, but that's mainly because we're seeing the clouds through it, and right now we're seeing a little bit of the hypervoxel along with the sphere itself. So really that's rendering basically correct. And with that lower refraction index just set to 1, it seems to have problems. And we'll go ahead and add in just a few more zeros to create a very slight refraction. So it's almost a refraction of 1. And we can render that frame, and we can already see it showing up, and it is rendering correctly. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're working with transparent objects, is that you need to turn up the refraction index just a tiny amount in order to get it to work correctly. Because otherwise what will happen is it will just be transparent to the background, which is black. And there are other ways of correcting that, basically going into view, rendering a frame, and then putting that in the background. But then you have to render every single frame twice, and it's not a very good fix for that problem. So we can see just by adding that tiny little bit of refraction, we were able to correct that transparency problem that we were seeing, and the overall frame looks really good. And we can see that showing up correctly. Of course, we could always add reflection back to the object along with the transparency. And just as long as we have that tiny little bit of refraction index, where I just have 0.001, which is still basically within the error or a vacuum. But of course, most refractive objects typically have a much higher refraction index anyway, so you usually don't run into too many problems with it. But if you are working with a refraction index of 1 in your scene, know that that will correct the problem, just adding that tiny little bit of a decimal all the way at the end. And we're going to move on now and take a look at the interaction between particle collisions and using hypervoxels within a little more realistic scene, and not just a couple of spheres.